As Napoleon marched east toward Saint-Étienne, he believed he was about to turn the entire war on its head. His plan was bold, classic Napoleon: strike at the Allies' rear, cut their communications, force them to abandon their advance on Paris and chase him instead. He imagined another series of victories like the 6 Days, catching separated columns, crushing them one by one, until the coalition collapsed under the weight of its own panic. But the Allies had finally learned the lesson they should have learned years earlier. You cannot beat Napoleon by letting him choose the battlefield. And so, for the first time in the entire war, they made the cold, ruthless choice Napoleon never expected. They ignored him. As his army moved east, theirs turned west. They drove toward Paris with every available man. It was a gamble. But it was the one gamble that could end the war in a single stroke. In Paris, panic erupted as reports trickled in from the countryside. Enemy cavalry sightings increased. Refugees flooded into the city. The government scrambled to prepare defenses. Joseph Bonaparte, Napoleon's brother, was left in charge. But Joseph was no general. He hesitated when he needed to act, issued orders only to cancel them hours later, and spent more time worrying about evacuation than defense. Meanwhile, two marshals, Marmont and Mortier, commanded the small force left to defend the capital, barely 30,000 men, many of them inexperienced National Guardsmen armed with outdated muskets. They were expected to stop the combined armies of Russia, Prussia, and Austria, nearly 10 times their number. Still, Parisians began digging. Women carried earth in baskets. Students formed battalions. Old men sharpened blades. The city had rarely looked more vulnerable, or more determined. But inside the French high command, another battle was beginning, a battle of loyalty. Some marshals had lost faith in Napoleon. Others feared the devastation a siege would bring. Many believed peace was the only salvation for France. And now, with Napoleon far from Paris, the future of the empire depended on men who were no longer certain the empire should survive. Napoleon, unaware of the political unraveling behind him, continued his march east. At Saint-Étienne, he struck what he thought was an isolated Russian force. He drove them back, captured prisoners, and believed he was about to spark chaos in the Allied rear. His army, exhausted but invigorated, sensed victory, until a group of captured Russian officers revealed the truth. The Allies were not retreating. They were not chasing him. They were marching on Paris. Napoleon froze. The realization hit him with the force of a cannon shot. He had been outmaneuvered not on the battlefield, but in strategy, in politics, in timing. Paris was exposed, and he was 60 miles away, marching in the wrong direction. In that moment, Napoleon made one of the most ferocious decisions of his career. He would march back to Paris at once. No rest, no delay, no retreat. He would save the capital or die trying. His men, haggard and starving, followed him without hesitation. They had marched with him through Italy, Egypt, Austria, Germany, Poland. Russia always forward, always toward the sound of cannons. Now they marched to save their own homeland, but the march was too long, the roads too broken, the horses too few, and the Allies too fast. On March 29th, the coalition armies appeared on the plains outside Paris. More than 100,000 men, Marmont and Mortier, deployed their small force along the northern heights of the city. Montmartre, Belleville, Romainville. Cannons were dragged into position. Civilians packed the streets below, waiting for the first gunshot. It came. At dawn, Russian guns thundered. Bavarian skirmishers advanced through vineyards. Prussian cavalry encircled the defenders. The Battle of Paris had begun. The French fought with the desperation of men defending their homes. The National Guard fired from behind stone walls. Students from the École Polytechnique manned artillery. Young boys carried powder and shouted orders. Mortier directed the defense with calm efficiency, while Marmont's corps absorbed the heaviest blows. Throughout the morning, the French lines bent but did not break. Allied commanders were astonished. They had expected a swift collapse. Instead, they were forced into brutal house-to-house fighting. But numbers tell their own story. By noon, the French were being pushed back toward the inner districts of the city. Mortier's gun line was shredded. Ormont's men were bleeding out. The National Guard broke in several places. Russian shells crashed into the outskirts, igniting fires. Word spread among the defenders that Napoleon was coming. Any minute now, they whispered. Any hour now, he would appear behind the enemy and crush them. They fought on with renewed fury, but Napoleon was still days away. At 3 p.m, Emperor Alexander of Russia ordered a final assault. The Allied armies surged forward, overwhelming the defenders. Marmont realized the city would soon be stormed. He met with Alexander's representatives and negotiated a formal capitulation. In the late afternoon, the guns fell silent. Paris had surrendered. When the news reached Napoleon on the road, he stopped in his tracks. Officers watched as he stood motionless, jaw set, eyes distant, as if the world had shifted beneath his feet. He had lost Paris. He had lost France. He had lost the one thing he had always believed he could count on in war. Time, but he refused to accept defeat. He marched to Fontainebleau and gathered the remnants of his army. He summoned his marshals and revealed his plan. March on Paris immediately. Attack the capital. Drive the Allies out. Retake the city in one decisive blow. The marshals looked at each other, then at the floor. Not one supported the plan. Ney spoke first, then MacDonald, then Lefebvre. They told him the truth. The army was spent. Paris would not rise. France could not endure another battle, and the Allies would burn the city rather than surrender it again. For the first time in his career, Napoleon faced united opposition from the men who had once followed him, without question. The empire was over and his marshals were choosing survival over loyalty. In the early hours of April 6th, with no options left, Napoleon agreed to abdicate the throne of France. The man who had dominated Europe for 2 decades, who had reshaped nations and shattered armies, signed a document that reduced him from emperor to exile. He asked only that he be allowed to keep the title of emperor. The Allies agreed, saying no harm in a title without a nation. And so, Napoleon, emperor of nothing, prepared to leave the France he had ruled, defended, and nearly destroyed. At Fontainebleau, he met his imperial guard for a final farewell. The courtyard fell silent as he stepped onto the balcony. For a moment, he hesitated. Then, with a voice surprisingly steady, he thanked them as companions, his soldiers, his brothers. Many wept. Some fainted. Napoleon embraced his veterans one last time. "I cannot embrace you all," he said, "but I embrace you in the person of your general." Then he left. As he traveled south toward exile on the island of Elba, France entered a new era, one shaped not by conquest, but by defeat. Yet even in exile, even as kings reclaimed thrones and Europe tried to rebuild, one truth remained. Napoleon's 1814 campaign had stunned the world. With a shattered army, he had fought 5 victorious battles in 6 days. He had outmaneuvered 3 coalitions. He had resisted overwhelming force for weeks. He had shown flashes of the genius that once ruled a continent. And although his empire fell, his legend did not. For even his enemies admitted that in those final months, abandoned, crushed by odds, no army could overcome Napoleon fought with a brilliance unmatched in European history. The 1814 campaign was not just his last, it was one of his greatest. Napoleon's 1814 campaign opens like a storm breaking over Europe. A last, desperate flare of brilliance from a man the world believed was finished. It begins with France on the brink of collapse. Allied armies, Austrian, Prussian, Russian, hundreds of thousands strong, are pouring across its borders from every direction. Paris trembles. The empire is dying. And yet, in this moment of doom, Napoleon unleashes a display of military genius, so audacious, so improbable, that even his enemies would later admit they had never seen anything like it. The year is 1814, and France has never stood more alone. After the catastrophe in Russia and the grinding defeat in Germany, Napoleon's Grand Army is gone. His marshals are weary, many disillusioned, some even flirting with betrayal. France faces invasion by 3 massive coalitions determined to end Napoleon forever. They are sure he cannot stop them. They are certain this final march will be easy. They are wrong. Napoleon arrives from the east with barely 70,000 effective exhausted veterans, raw conscripts, wounded survivors dragged back into service. Boys and old men formed into emergency battalions. It is barely an army, but in Napoleon's hands, even this is a weapon. He looks at the approaching tide of enemies and sees not doom, but an opportunity. If the Allies advance on separate roads, maintaining their wide front, their advantage becomes a weakness. He cannot beat them together, but he can beat them one by one. That single thought becomes the heartbeat of the campaign. As the Allies argue among themselves, Napoleon acts. He moves with the speed of a man who believes hesitation is death. And in early February, the frozen plains of Champagne become his hunting ground. At Campubé, he strikes Marseille-Safif's isolated Russian corps. He smashes it in hours. The Russians, stunned, can scarcely believe Napoleon has returned to the field with such force. But he is already moving. The next day, he hurls his army west toward Bucharest's Prussian columns are strung out, exhausted, unaware that Napoleon is only hours away. Out of the winter mist, French troops crash into them with relentless fury. Prussian lines bend, falter, break. Bucharest men flee in chaos, beaten by an army half their size. The momentum is intoxicating. Napoleon refuses to let the Allies breathe. He marches again, driving his men to their physical limit. At Château Thierry, he hammers the retreating Prussians, shattering their rear guard, capturing guns, wagons, prisoners. Then, pushing north, he storms Vauchamps, where Blucher tries to stand once more. French cavalry under Grouchy ride like demons across the snow, cutting down Prussians as they struggled to escape. Blucher barely survives. 4 victories in 5 days, what later becomes known as the 6 Days Campaign. And suddenly Europe panics. The Allies had marched into France, expecting collapse. Instead, they found the Napoleon of Austerlitz, of Jena, of Wagram, man reborn through desperation. But victories alone cannot change the scale of the challenge. The Allies still have nearly 10 times Napoleon's manpower, and as Napoleon marches back toward the Seine, word reaches him that Schwarzenberg's massive army of Bohemia is pushing toward Paris. Napoleon knows the danger. Paris is the heart of France. If it falls, the war is over. He pivots south with terrifying speed. At Montero, he finds Austrian and Württemberg forces trying to regroup. He attacks without hesitation. French guns roar across the river valley. French infantry storm the bridges. And Napoleon, furious at his wavering marshals, pushes them personally into the fight. The enemy collapses under the pressure. Once again, Napoleon wins. Once again, he proves he can still dominate a battlefield. But his marshals are cracking. Many are exhausted. Some openly question whether any of this still matters. They whisper that France cannot be saved. Napoleon brushes them aside. If you are tired, he snaps, go home, I will fight alone. But even he can feel the truth closing in. Every victory drains his army further. Every mile marched is agony. Replacements are gone. Ammunition is running low. Horses are dying. The Allies know it too, and as their generals gather, they make a cold, strategic decision. Stop fighting Napoleon on his terms. Stop chasing him. Stop letting him isolate them. Instead, ignore him, march around him, on strike directly at Paris. Napoleon senses the shift almost immediately. Reports filter in from villages along the Seine. The Allies are splitting into 2 columns, one feinting near the river, the other slipping north toward the capital. If they reach Paris before Napoleon, the war ends in humiliation, and so begins one of the most intense races of the age. Napoleon hurls his army west, trying to wedge himself between the Allies and Paris. He marches through villages filled with terrified civilians, past churches packed with refugees, through lands ravaged by months of war. Everywhere he goes, people stare at him with a mixture of awe and dread. They know this man can change the fate of France or plunge it further into ruin. Near Troyes, he strikes the Allied flank, winning sharp engagements at Barzarab and Lobrisol. but the Allies absorb the blows and keep moving. They have learned they refuse battle unless the numbers wildly favor them. Napoleon tries to rally his marshals again. Some respond with renewed vigor, Mortier, McDonald. Others drag their feet. He senses something is wrong. Loyalties are fraying. The old fire of the empire is vanishing. Still, he pushes on. In mid-March, he launches a brilliant counterstroke at Reims, retaking the city in a dazzling night attack. The victory seems to open a path, another chance to isolate Blue. He marches hard, determined to repeat the miracles of February, but this time his army is too spent, too thin, too slow. The Allies slip away, avoiding the trap. Napoleon's frustration grows. For the first time in his career, he is fighting not just armies, but time itself. He knows the Allies are closing in on Paris from the north and east. He knows that if he marches toward them, they will simply retreat, drawing him farther from the capital until they can strike behind his back. He knows he is being outmaneuvered strategically even as he defeats them tactically. Near Assisurabe, Napoleon encounters the leading elements of Schwarzenberg's massive force. He believes it is only a rear guard. He orders an advance. Moments later, the French crest a ridge and stare down at a sea of Allied troops, an entire army arrayed against them. For the first time, Napoleon hesitates. He pulls back across the OB in a controlled retreat, his army battered but intact. It is a sobering moment. His luck, for the first time, seems to be running out. Yet he refuses to quit. His solution is daring. Swing east, threaten the Allied supply lines, march into their rear, and force them to chase him instead of Paris. If he can lure them away from the capital, he still has a chance. Paris can be saved. France can be saved. The empire might yet survive, and so he marches east toward Saint-Izia. With the remnants of his army, villagers watch as the thin blue columns pass by hungry, frostbitten, ragged shadows of the legions that once conquered Europe. But there is still steel in their eyes. They are marching with Napoleon. They believe he will find a way. They always have. Little do they know, as they march away from Paris, that fate has already begun to turn against them. The Allies have made a decision that will change everything. They will no longer follow Napoleon. They will strike directly for Paris at full speed before he can return. And in the capital, traitors and wavering generals are already whispering, negotiating, plotting. France is heading toward its reckoning, and Napoleon is marching in the wrong direction. Part 2 will continue the fall of Paris, the betrayal, Napoleon's desperate final moves, and the end of the 1814 campaign.